These are the 10 most legendary, elite, and highly classified special operations units of the 20th century.
Number 10. They painted their faces black and vanished into darkness.
In 1943 Italy, a joint American and Canadian strike force was sent to do the absolutely impossible.
The Germans called them the Black Devils. They never even heard them coming.
Guards would wake up sweating, only to find their bunkmates eliminated in total silence.
The killers left a terrifying calling card, a warning that the worst was yet to come.
Entire Nazi regiments retreated in absolute terror, unwilling to face the ghosts in the mountains.
They owned the frozen peaks. But across the world, a different breed of killers hid beneath the earth.
Number 9. 1968. Vietnam.
American GIs called them ghosts. They could lay perfectly still in the freezing mud for days.
Sweating profusely, these sappers crawled through razor wire, armed only with raw explosives and absolute devotion. They bypassed heavily fortified perimeter defenses without a sound, planting deadly satchel charges in the dark. The psychological terror was absolute. You could be surrounded by 1,000 men and still feel hunted. The jungle was a psychological meat grinder, but in the freezing Afghan mountains, a different monster hunted.
Number 8. The Soviet Spetsnaz.
During 1979 in Afghanistan, elite Russian operators neutralized a heavily fortified presidential palace in absolute darkness. The guards were completely slaughtered in minutes. The Spetsnaz left no survivors, only a chilling, bloody message. To become a Spetsnaz, recruits endured blood-soaked training designed to completely shatter their human empathy. They were transformed into emotionless weapons, perfectly willing to eliminate targets without a single moment of hesitation. In Afghanistan, their mere presence was a psychological weapon. Entire villages were erased to send a message. They struck without mercy and vanished into the freezing dark, leaving only rumors and absolute terror behind. But while the Soviets relied on sheer brutality, another elite unit mastered the deadly art of precision.
Number 7. The British SAS turned a crisis into a masterclass.
In 1980 London, insurgents took over the Iranian embassy. For 6 agonizing days, the world held its breath. But on day 6, the waiting ended. The famous Special Air Service was finally unleashed. Adrenaline surged as black-clad operators rappelled from the roof, their fingers trembling slightly on the triggers.
The explosives detonated, shattering the windows. The terrorists' seconds to live.
A stun grenade ignited the curtains. The embassy was suddenly engulfed in a roaring, chaotic inferno.
Despite the blinding smoke, they eliminated the terrorists and dragged the hostages out in just 17 minutes.
The message was written in blood. If you take innocent hostages, the SAS will show absolutely no mercy.
Number 5. The Celis Scouts. If this terrifies you, wait for number 1.
During the 1970s in Rhodesia, they mastered deception, dressing, and fighting exactly like the insurgents they relentlessly hunted. The psychological toll was heavy. They infiltrated enemy camps, eating beside the men they would soon slaughter. When the trap snapped shut, the jungle exploded. The enemy realized their own brothers were the killers. Paranoia deeply infected the rebels. They began executing their own men, terrified a Celis scout was hiding among them. They were hated, feared, and incredibly lethal. But eventually, the brutal, exhausting war consumed the entire nation.
The African sun finally set on the scouts. But in the freezing South Atlantic, an ancient nightmare was arriving.
Number 4. A terrifying warrior brotherhood born in the Himalayas.
Recruited by the British, these men were fearless. To face a Gurkha in combat meant absolute, certain death.
Argent soldiers were paralyzed by raw fear. Because once a Gurkha draws his curved blade in the dark,
The legendary Nepalese fighters swept through the freezing trenches, their war cries shattering the bitter Argentine night.
Whole battalions surrendered just hearing they were coming. The psychological terror was deadlier than the blade itself.
They proved raw human willpower still dominated modern war. But in the flooded jungles of Asia.
Number 3. 1968. Mekong Delta, Vietnam.
Rising silently from suffocating swamp water, these elite frogmen brought absolute hell to the enemy's own backyard. Sweat and heavy camouflage paint burned their eyes as they hunted the most elusive guerrilla force on Earth. They carried experimental, suppressed weapons, striking isolated enemy camps with terrifying precision before vanishing into the mud.
A single squad of 6 men could unleash the deafening firepower of an entire infantry company.
Number 2. Skorzeny's Commandos, the most dangerous men. Wait for number 1.
They didn't just kill, they caused absolute psychological collapse by wearing perfectly tailored Allied military uniforms. Speaking perfect English, they changed road signs and sent entire American armored columns into brutal, bloody traps. Paranoia was their greatest weapon. Terrified American soldiers started holding their own commanding generals at gunpoint.
Trust vanished completely. You had to shoot the man next to you over a simple baseball trivia question.
They proved deception was deadlier than bombs. But deep in Vietnam, number 1. They were the absolute pinnacle of covert warfare.
Deep in 1964, Vietnam and Laos, they officially did not exist. If captured, the government would deny everything. 6-man teams were dropped deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by tens of thousands of ruthless, heavily armed trackers. When compromised, they fought desperate battles, sometimes calling devastating napalm strikes directly onto their own bloody positions. They carried experimental weapons and wore untraceable uniforms. If captured, torture was absolutely guaranteed, and rescue was impossible.
They endured unimaginable psychological horror. But their ultimate sacrifice remained a classified government secret for decades. It took 30 long years for the government to finally admit their staggering, bloody sacrifices.
The 20th century birthed a terrifying reality. Wars were no longer won by massive armies, but by shadows. From frozen European peaks to burning Asian jungles, these elite units redefined the absolute limits of human endurance. Governments learned a dark truth. A handful of fearless men could completely shatter an entire nation from within. Their true identities were erased. Their monumental sacrifices were buried deep inside classified vaults, denied by history.
We celebrate their lethal victories. But we must never forget the heavy, bloody toll of their silent wars.
Don't get left behind when the next siren wails.